Hello and welcome to yet another episode of the Ancient World Magazine podcast. Today we're continuing our discussion on sculpture in the ancient Greek world. If you've missed part 1, it's advised that you listen to that before you check out this. Thanks.
Something I was thinking about earlier, but I'm going to bring up now we're getting into the classical period. Yosha mentioned about the bronze warriors in the 8th century that have their arms up probably to throw spears, but this has led some people to suspect that they represent Zeus. Of course, there is a famous statue of the 5th century that probably represents Zeus that is questionable because of its attributes, the so-called Artemisian Zeus that was fished out of the water at Artemision. Slightly larger than life-size bronze statue of a naked man with a beard, one arm stretched out in front of him as if sort of range-finding, and the other arm held behind his head to throw something. And the Zeus interpretation would say he is about to throw the thunderbolt. We have many smaller scale bronze depictions of Zeus holding thunderbolts in pretty much the same pose. The Poseidon interpretation says that he's holding a trident that he is about to throw. I don't know if anyone seriously holds up the Poseidon view. I think it's largely based on the idea that this statue was found underwater, but that probably has nothing to do with the original intent.
Without actually finding the objects in question, his attributes in question, I think it's impossible to say, because also in vase painting there is no distinction between Zeus, Poseidon and Hades. They're all fully mature men with full beards, and they're distinguished by their attributes.
Like their brothers or something.
Yeah, exactly. Sometimes, some scholars say they say, oh, Hades can be distinguished from his two brothers also by the expression in his eyes, because he always looks more mournful. But that's no. And especially the Zeus from the sea is very much also again this severe style statue, so this emphasis on movement. It's more likely for it to be Zeus, since Zeus is the more widely celebrated deity, of course. It's the king of the gods, but I don't think there's any way to know for sure, because that's something we haven't really touched upon, the fact also with some of the pediment sculptures that you have these, like at the Temple of Apphia, you have these figures that were supposed to hold like a bow or a sword or something, and these were things that were stuck into the hands and maybe were actual bows and actual swords.
And in this case also, and many others, the eye sockets are empty because the eyes would have been inlaid with jewels, or would have been inlaid
with colored stone or something of the sort. I have here in front of me the book, and we'll talk about polychromy later, but this is Gods in Color, Polychromy in the Ancient World. And they also talk about the Riachi bronzes, and they also have reconstructions of them. And for example, they talk about how it's bronze, but the lips were made of solid copper, so they would have a different color. The nipples were inlaid with copper. They would use asphalt or bitumen to darken certain areas of the bronze, like the beard and the hair. And they would use silver for the teeth, enameled silver for the teeth. And they would use colored stone for the eyes, and basically do all sorts of things in order to make the bronze look even more vivid. And of course, the bronze itself, when new, the skin, it would have been like a dark bronze, well tanned skin, basically. So it would have looked lifelike anyway. With all these additions in colors, it would have been even more realistic.
Well, I haven't seen the Riachi bronzes in person. There was a BBC documentary of someone in Italy. I could find out the name if I tried, but it's in Italy. And they went to Riachi and looked at the bronzes and had this amazing HD film showing the sculptures and the eyelashes, and compared to just watching that television show, pictures do not do these sculptures justice, and they're the kind of thing that you have to see in person, because you can see colour differentiation in the surviving statue.
Yeah, we should talk about polychromy.
Well, I'd like to think anyone listening to this podcast is well aware of the fact that Greek sculptures were painted, that they were not left white marble. But something I was thinking when we were going back to these Cycladic figurines, is that those were painted too. There is paint that survives on the Cycladic figurine. There are probably no marble sculptures from the ancient world that were not painted, going back to the early Bronze Age. And who knows about earlier? Specialists in the Neolithic, I guess, but not me.
Well, for the Neolithic figurines, the idea is that sometimes they will also had ochre applied to them and that sort of stuff. So the color seems to have been an integral part of statuettes and sculpture for basically as long as we can remember. The idea that all these things were left unpainted is not borne out by the evidence. The only question is how much was it painted? How brightly were they painted? The evidence that we have so far suggests that they were brightly painted all over, and there are some people that find that kitsch and then argue, it was painted but not that much,
The thing that both of those arguments miss, that I think is a point made by Stansbury O'Donnell in his History of Greek Art, is that if this white marble was painted very brightly when it was first commissioned, I suppose, then it still sat out there in Greece, in the sunlight, getting old. There would be weathering. And there is a question of would the paint be reapplied? Would they try and keep it looking new? Would they let it get old? I mean, these are still questions we have in the preservation of ancient monuments, is how much should you restore, how much should you allow to lie in ruins? So even if they were brightly painted, they probably wouldn't stay brightly painted for very long. And I don't know enough about current research on painted marble. I wonder how much research is done into how these statues would have looked after 5 years, after 20 years. The Parthenon was there for a long time. How well did the paint hold up? And was it reapplied? Because that is another part of the question, is if they really wanted these things to look brightly painted, then they could be brightly painted.
I think there is some written evidence to suggest that maintenance of religious structures, at least, was done. I mean, Homer already mentions about, I think it was Agamemnon boasting about how he renewed the roof of the temple, for example. Something along those lines. I forget the exact reference, but it's in there. So, there was this idea that these things had to be maintained and the paint would peel off, wash away. So I would imagine, but I also wouldn't be able to say for sure, that they would reapply the paint regularly as part of these maintenance activities.
Ideally, it would be, the maintenance routine would keep the color up, but thinking about like later Rome and things that Augustus supposedly did, restoring the temples and things in Rome, if in that city temples were allowed to either fall apart or just not go through the regular maintenance that required. I mean, it's very possible that the ideal was not adhered to in the Greek world as well.
Oh, no, I think that's very... I mean, if you look at the Mediterranean now, I mean, sometimes a building is very well maintained, sometimes a building is basically left to rot until someone decides at some point, well, let's do something about this. And in a period where you have a much less centralized government and where everything is left more to individuals trying to pick up the slack and investing money in something because it enhances their personal status, their familial status, or whatever reason they might have, that might be even worse, of course. And some temples would have been undoubtedly more important than others.
If you're talking about aesthetic interests, then the implication here surely is that if they are restoring the paint, then brightly painted sculptures and buildings were considered attractive. That's what was wanted. And if they are not repainting them, and we are considering that an element of neglect, then that is not something that is considered beautiful or worthwhile. They are neglected because they are neglected. And if we're talking about what people liked to look at, then we're still going with brightly painted. Even if some of them are neglected, then the ones that aren't, we're considering that neglect, basically.
I think if you think about the architectural sculptures, so the metapiece that we talked about, and the friezes and the pediments, most of those would have been fairly protected from the elements as well. I mean, the metapiece and the friezes, they would have been at least partially underneath the roof cover, and the pediments would be interesting to... I mean, just as a sort of an aside, because most of the temples are oriented east-west, with dominant winds in the Aegean, if that had any effect on what the wear and tear would be on different parts of the temples. But anyway, it might also explain why over time, for example, you see that there's a tendency for the reliefs to be cut deeper and deeper into the stone, that maybe that also had some sort of function, because the deeper the relief is, the less prone it is to being washed away in a few rain showers, for example. So there might also have been a reason to cut these reliefs in deeper than in the earlier parts of Greek history.
In July, August, there is a very strong north wind in the Aegean that I don't believe is a new phenomena. I think that is...
No, it's the Boreas. It's
quite
known also in ancient times. No.
That makes sailing the Cyclades difficult at that time. So you have there... I don't know that any other time of the year there is a particularly strong wind from any of the other 7 directions. But just the thought there, the sun directions are, of course, east, south, and west, mostly. So the sun bleaching be coming from those directions, while the worst wind, as far as I'm aware, would be north. So, I don't know. That would be an interesting avenue of research, perhaps, to see.
They have done research, of course, on the remains of pigments on statues. And that seems like it was just applied once. At least that's the idea. Because they have like these detailed photographs. Unless they continuously repainted in exactly the same way. I don't know, the impression is that maybe they were painted only once.
Obviously, you could strip the paint off and completely go. I don't know if we would be able to detect that.
I think you would be able to detect that, but if you searched for it, but I'm not sure if they searched for it.
I was just, before this podcast, flipping through a collection of sculpture from Magna Graecia, and the complexity of some of the painting patterns really does pop, because there's a lot of the color left on the terracotta statues from, like, Paestum. And just looking at even the so-called enthroned god from Paestum statue, the back of his tunic is so complex that it would be extremely difficult, you would think, to repaint it exactly the same.
Well, when I think of statues that were well preserved, or on which the paint is well preserved, the Acropolis chori. So we mentioned earlier that chori were often dedications, and we know masses of them from the Acropolis because they appear to have been buried to preserve them when the city was abandoned before the Persians sank. But also Praxiteles seems to have been treated in the same way. She seems to have been buried possibly to protect the statue from the Persian sack, that's the theory, and the paint is preserved on there. But also the old temple of Athena from the Acropolis, with its depiction of Geryon, the 3-bodied monster, which preserves some of its paint. And I think a lot of these are probably things that may not have been out for, well, I guess we are dealing with nearly a century in some of those cases. I don't know. But it may be different for a monument that stood for millennia, like the Parthenon, compared to the old temple of Athena that the Parthenon replaced, which was there for 50, 100 years.
Yeah, not even.
50, because it was destroyed.
Then I want to continue talking about the classical period, and want to delve into more of the themes. Maybe we should talk a bit more about male versus female. We talked, for example, about nudity. We talked about the female nudes that you encounter sometimes in 8th and 7th century, and in the 6th century it's all basically the standard is clothed females and naked men. In the 5th century you have, there's more variety, but women still tend to be fully dressed. And towards the end of the 5th century BC you get the so-called wet drapery style, which you also see on the caryatids of the Ertheion on the Acropolis, where these women appear to be wearing these thick garments, basically, that seem to be soaked in water, so it brings out their features. And as soon as you get into the 4th century BC, all of a sudden you start getting all of these experiments with large female nudes, which is completely new. We didn't have that before. You get the typical example is the Aphrodite of Cnidos as the archetypical 4th century statue of a naked woman. You get the work by Praxiteles and Lysippos, where they make men deities, but also, in this case, almost always goddesses, especially Aphrodite, fully in the nude. And that's a completely new phenomenon that we have at that point, where apparently there's no longer this taboo about depicting the naked female form, as opposed to the naked male form, which was never a taboo, never a problem with Greek sculptors. Maybe we want to talk a bit about what the issues might be there. Why did this happen?
Well, I'd also throw in that even as the female nude gets more popular, the clothed male does not. There are very few examples that we know of that we can point to of men in clothes. There's a standard Dionysus, I think, from the 4th century, who's sort of in robes, but there are sort of two different types of Dionysus from the time. The sort of youthful, young, naked man with the drinking from a cup or holding grapes, and then there's the older Dionysus in thick robes with a beard, and yeah, that is the only example I can think of a clothed male statue, freestanding statue.
Yeah, from the 4th century, the new thing is fully three-dimensional naked women, which didn't happen before. And even then there is sort of this hint at eroticism that is sort of lacking with the male statues. I mean, if you look at the Aphrodite of Cnidos by Praxiteles, dates to about 350 BC. The original was probably from bronze, I should say, first of all, as most of these large Greek statues tended to be originally made in bronze, and we just have the Roman copies now, because the Romans later were so taken with Greek art that they wanted more of that for themselves, and they made loads of marble copies, and that's how we have a lot of our evidence for Greek sculptures, because all the bronzes were lost apart from ones that happened to have been preserved, like the Zeus from the sea. So you have the Aphrodite of Cnidos, which is this large statue, Praxiteles, typical proportions for the 4th century, and a fairly small head, long legs, relatively speaking, and she's taking off her garment. She has it in her left hand, and with her right hand she's sort of covering her genital area slightly. And so the idea is this supposed to represent some form of modesty on the part of the goddess of love, or is this supposed to invite the viewer from actually getting closer and seeing what's behind the hand? What do the goddess's naughty bits look like? So there's sort of this idea that there's this sort of playful eroticism that's being introduced in the 4th century that would be taken to even further extremes in the course of the Hellenistic period that might already be here in the 4th century. That's a big difference compared to male statues that are not overtly eroticized.
Yeah, there's that element of voyeurism,
Yeah.
and I think that is significant because you do have statues like the possibly original Praxiteles, although there is debate about this, from Olympia, that is Hermes holding the baby Dionysus, and it's a very nicely formed statue, let's say that, especially from behind, that is not necessarily an unattractive male figure, but that is not sexualized in the way the Aphrodite statues are. Like, there is a very clear attempt on behalf of the sculpture, we assume, based on the Roman copies, to sort of imply voyeurism of this Aphrodite, that you're sort of stumbling upon her as she gets out of the bath, that you don't have with male statues, even if they are theoretically attractive male bodies. These are not sexualized in the same way.
Well, not in the 4th century, at least, in the classical and archaic period.
No.
When you get to the Hellenistic period, it becomes different, because especially during, let's say, the full Baroque Hellenistic period from about 250 BC to 150 BC, that 1 century, you get stuff like the Barberini Fountain, which is very famous, which is this depiction of a sleeping satyr that it looks like you've stumbled upon him while he's sleeping in the forest, and he's leaning back. He has a very chiseled anatomy, and his legs are spread apart, basically, so you get a full view of his genitals. And that piece, again, it's very voyeuristic in that sense, and so you get that this sort of ogling male physique, which, who knows, might have been a factor with some people in the 5th to 4th centuries as well, but it becomes overt only in Hellenistic period, whereas you get this voyeurism and this implied eroticism with female nudes, at least from the 4th century onward. Of course, we talk about female nudes, but perhaps you should also emphasize that it wasn't normal for Greek women to go about naked in public, whereas, of course,
right,
Greek men were supposed to engage in sports and gymnastics naked, and they also went together to the bathhouse or whatever to be naked and that sort of stuff. So that's of course also a factor that plays here, that women were always supposed to be dressed when they went out and about in the house. They weren't supposed to engage in sports or other naked activities, at least in public. So that's a major difference. So that's why also probably depicting these fully naked women must have been titillating on the part of the male viewers, at least. And one sort of wonders who the sculptors used as a model.
And we are again talking about sculpture here. The situation is different in vase painting, which is of course not public art that's on display. So you find naked women much earlier, certainly from red figure. I can't think of a black figure example, but sort of from the late 6th century in red figure art, there are many different ways in which artists depict naked women. And these are, they've been sort of categorized, I think, by Howard again and others. So talking about, with men you have heroic nudity. That's not really something you get with women. You get more what we call empathetic or nudity in depictions of especially Ajax raping Cassandra.
An appeal to pathos
in the Trojan War. Yeah. And then there are the very sexual scenes of
orgies.
People having sex. Yeah. Orgies in the early red figure art.
Yeah.
Which are, again, a different kind of nudity that is entirely sexual. But there's an intense, in my notes I was looking over for the sort of archaic classical change, sort of noting that there is this intense depiction of hardcore sex between free men and disenfranchised prostitutes in Richard Mere's words from his 2012 Greek art book. But this is just early classical. By sort of the end of what we call the severe style in Greek art, in sculpture, this kind of thing has disappeared. But it's symposium pottery. It's pottery from private events in the household that were mostly attended by men and slave women, household servants.
The euphemistically called flute girls.
Yeah, so this is, the nudity is... in Greek art is a strong indicator of the patriarchal flavour of their society. That male nudity is just this normal thing that is usually unsexualized but can be sexualized. Female nudity is heavily eroticized.
There's a really nice, I always show this in my classes that I teach on Greek art, really nice Hellenistic statue from about 100 BC about Aphrodite, Pan, and Eros. And it's a statue where Pan is grabbing Aphrodite by one of her arms, and Eros is holding his horn, and also one hand hovering above Aphrodite, and Aphrodite holds a sandal up as if she's going to hit him, whack him over the head with this. And she's also covering her genitals with her left hand. And this is also a scene with a double meaning, because on the one hand it seems like she's trying to get rid of him, but on the other hand, holding your sandal up was a sign known to sailors, at least from the Hellenistic period onwards, of prostitutes. So prostitutes in the harbour, you would be able to recognize them because they would be women holding up a sandal.
Something you can debate among yourselves after listening to this podcast is whether Greek art is created by largely male artists presuming their viewers are free male citizens, or targeting their viewers as free male citizens, or whether we as free male citizens of our respective countries are discussing it from that perspective as how we have come to understand it. I think Robin Osborne has an article from the late 90s about Koros and Kore statues called Looking on Greek Style, and it's sort of about the different reactions viewers would have looking at these sculptures and how different you would judge them based on being a free male citizen viewer or a citizen woman or whoever. I don't think again, it's been a while since I read this, so maybe giving him more credit for the number of perspectives he thinks about, but certainly the idea that these statues are designed to give across a certain message that may be read differently based on them. And the intended viewer always seems to be, in the 6th century statues, the free male citizen.
Yeah, one disadvantage we have is that all of the written sources that we are written from the perspective of men. We don't have any female writers for the Greek periods, except, a poet like Sappho. But nearly everyone else is all male, and they generally don't seem to be too interested in art. Pausanias is a bit of an exception, of course. But yeah, that's also trying to figure out what the point of view would have been if these statues were intended for the male gaze, let's say, instead of something else. That's difficult to ascertain.
This is slightly off topic, but also continuing this thought, moving from gender to things we can get from actually looking at these statues. So going back to the Artemisian Zeus, something that is indicated by the shape of that statue, its outstretched arm is slightly longer than life size. It's slightly longer than it should be. But looked at from the front, so you're looking up at the hand and the face, it looks in proportion. It looks accurate from that angle. So the implication here is that this is the side of the statue you're supposed to look at it from. Of course, it's a three-dimensional object, so you probably would look at it from multiple angles, but this is where it seems the sculptor is expecting you to look at it from. And if he were holding a trident from that angle, it covers a lot of his face, or it looks very wrong for him to be holding a trident from that angle. And that's another argument why this is Zeus. But a lot of the sculptures we have, so with the Tyrannosides that are a pair of sculptures, we don't quite know how they stood next to one another. There are vase paintings that depict this statue group that give us an idea of how they might have been arranged, but this is depicting three-dimensional art in 2 dimensions, so we can struggle with that as well, figuring out how we think these statues might have been arranged. But I don't know how far it changes your interpretation of them. If with the Tyrannosides you might think Aristogeiton is being more defensive because he's covering the back while Harmodius strides forward to attack. But an interesting point, again in Stansbury O'Donnell's History of Greek Art, is he has some personal photographs of these sculptures from the Temple of a Fire on Aegina, and he has taken those pictures looking up at the pediment, at the fallen Greek warrior. And we normally see pedimental sculptures when depicted in textbooks. You normally see them from the front, as if you were sort of 6 meters high looking straight at them, rather than if you were standard 5 to 6 feet tall human. 160 to 180 centimeters tall human for our European listeners, looking up at these pediments high above you. Like, the views we get of Greek sculpture are not the views of Greek architectural sculpture, are not the views that contemporaries would have had of them. And it is interesting to see how the effect of the wounded Greek soldiers from the corner of the pediments of the Temple of the Fire changes when you look at it by crouching on the ground, so you can look up, as opposed to looking straight at it as they are displayed in the Munich museum they're in, that I have not been to, but would like to, because of those sculptures, which were sadly stolen.
Sadly stolen from Greece, yeah. That's also, we didn't talk about the so-called Archaic Smile, which is what you find on a lot of archaic Greek statues, where they have this enigmatic smile. And there have been all sorts of theories proposed, including that archaic Greek sculptors were somehow incapable of making a face without a smile, which is utterly nonsense, of course. But again, most of these statues were supposed to be viewed from below, looking up. And if you have a straight mouth and you look at it from below, it would seem like the corners of the mouth were turned down, whereas if you make the smile and you look from down below, the mouth appears to be in a neutral position. So that probably explains also the origin of the archaic smile, even though you don't really see it anymore in classical art. Don't knock that, but at least that's one of it's whenever I go to the museum, there's the museum in Amsterdam, there used to be an archaic head, and I always told my students then to kneel, like what you also said, kneel and then look up at the face, and they would say, oh yeah, now the smile disappears. And I said that's how it was supposed to be seen. So yeah, but yeah, about three-dimensionality, the really good example of the fact that some statues weren't meant to be viewed from all sides is the Discobolos by Myron, which is a very famous discus thrower statue. I mean, our listeners will undoubtedly have seen it in one form or another. It's this man trying to hurl a discus attributed to Myron, dated to about 450 BC. The marble version we have is a copy. The original was from bronze. It's very typical for the high classical style in that, this is a man supposedly engaged in an activity, but if you look at his muscles, they're all relaxed. It's the high classical art. People never seem to exert themselves in any particular sense, and even this discus thrower, which sort of severe style motion in it in order to create a dynamic composition. He's trying to throw a discus, but the statue also, it's always photographed from the side, so you can see him in all of his glory. But that's also because if you photograph it from the front, let's say where his head is pointed at, it looks really strange because it's actually quite flat. So it was probably originally made to be put up against a wall or even in an alcove or something. It wasn't meant to be walked around, and that's sometimes it's photographs can be very deceptive in that particular way, in that the statue looks like this Discobolos looks like he could walk all around like it's a fully three-dimensional statue, but it isn't.
But there are some quite interesting exceptions to this sort of rule when we look at pedimental sculpture, especially. So the development of pedimental sculpture pretty much goes that the earliest ones are reliefs like the metopes and friezes, but by the end of the 6th century, you are finding them essentially freestanding sculptures placed on a platform. And they will often have sort of metal attachments to hold them in place and things so that they don't. But they vary in terms of how much detail is put on the back of these sculptures. Because, of course, no one would ever see the back of these sculptures once they are up in the pediment. However, there's clear evidence of paint on the back of the pedimental sculptures from the Temple of a Fire on Agana. The Olympia pediments have the same thing. There's detail on the back. The Temple of Zeus at Olympia, the pediments from there is detail on the back. On the Acropolis statues, I believe they were sculpted in the round, but then it looks as if the backs have been cut away in order to fit them on the platform. So we have this question of how people were looking at these things, because it would have always been from a distance, and yet there is so much work gone into things that people may never see that is always fascinating to me. I don't know that I have anything interesting to say about it, but it's one of my favourite things to do with a statue, sort of look at it from behind and see how much work went into the other direction, and whether this means how far the sculptor seemed to have thought you would have seen the back, and how much they cared about what the back like.
I only have a funny personal anecdote to add about that. I was yelled at in the National Archaeological Museum in Athens for trying to look at the back of something once by one of the most aggressive docents I have ever encountered.
Speaking of context, we've been thinking a lot about these sculptures kind of in Greece and in their creation context. But of course we know many of them from Roman copies, so I don't know if Josh wants to talk to us about Greeks overseas and things.
I mean, obviously, archaic and classical Greek sculpture had an impact on archaic and classical Italy. There's striking influence of Greek sculptural technique in Etruscan art, at least from the 6th century on, perhaps 7th onward. But it's definitely a case of gelocalization, I think is the term, in which Etruscan artisans seem to have taken up certain elements of style, but retained Etruscan elements as well. There isn't a wholesale transition in these periods to an entirely style of sculpture, which is interesting, obviously, because that's not always the case. But I think even in southern Italy and Sicily, where the Greeks began to settle, there is a difference in style with the Aegean. If I remember right from reading very long ago, Magna Graecia had something of a mixed style of both Italic influence and Greek influence that resulted in essentially a unique approach to sculpture, just as in phase painting, because obviously like the Campanian red figure and stuff is very different from the red figure that we find elsewhere, or even in the Greek influence, because vase painting in Etruria was much more heavily, or took a more Hellenized turn. I mean, that brings us back though to something that I interjected with at the beginning of the podcast, that the materials in which Sicilian and Southern Italian Greek sculptors worked, the media was very different from in the Aegean. Few bronzes survive. A lot of what we have that does survive is terracotta. I think that is probably the most common medium in which sculptors were working there, although limestone was also used, as it was throughout Italy, before alabaster and then imported marble, or to be Hellenistic period and later. Which is interesting, because this could be why, if you flip through, almost any book on sculpture in Magna Graecia, or Greek art in general in that area, you'll see more preserved painted sculpture than I think we have and obviously I don't know the chemistry behind this, but it could be that the medium itself is what helped it.
Yeah, speaking about color being preserved, but we have of course also the colored stela from Mycenae, which dates from about the same period as the warrior vase, which also has a similar scene, warriors in a line, and there's also paint preserved on that. So just to sort of tie back into the discussion of painted sculptural reliefs having a very old ancestry, it goes back all the way to the beginning, basically.
There's also the factor that more recent, let's call them antiquarians, may have got rid of some of the surviving paint from certain Greek sculptures in prominent museums. So that is another factor that affects preservation. Statues like Phresyclea partially preserved their paint because they were discovered more recently and had paint on them, rather than people who wanted them to look like white marble scrubbed the paint off them.
That's very true, or very possible even in Magna Graecia, because I think a lot of the terracottas that I'm thinking of that are painted are, mid to late 20th century excavation.
Yeah, I'm also thinking about the Etruscan terracotta, talking about how the Greeks, adapted from the Egyptians and from the Near East, the sculptures and the architectural stuff. The Etruscans, of course, also adapted from the Greeks rather than adopted wholesale. Because if you look at Etruscan temples where they have these large terracotta statues of deities on the roofs, where the pediments were usually left empty, but you had like these large statues on the roofs, which is something you don't find in quote unquote the Greek world. So it's again adapting rather than adopting something as such.
Yeah, you do see pediment sculptures though, even by I think the 6th century. There are pediment sculptures in central Italy, because like the head image that we used for Mayan Rolkaninen-Dyke's short Ancient World magazine article on hoplites and phalanxes from Fileri. Short-ish. I guess that was long
one specific
for us.
Article on that topic.
But the head image we used from Fileri was a pediment sculpture, and that dates to the 6th century. And yeah, it's all terracotta. All of this was, and in fact, when we talk about Central Italian, I prefer that for this rather than Etruscan, because it's a phenomenon that is regional and not necessarily cultural or tied to a single linguistic culture here. The temples did have friezes similar to what we see in Greek temples, and they almost certainly were painted as well, but they were terracotta, and they were made from forms. So we actually know a number of series of these friezes that were cast from probably the same molds, or at least molds based on earlier casting from a number of different. But that could have been some sort of adaptation from a Greek style. Of course, in the sources we're told that Demaratus the Greek fled Kupsalos to come to Tarquinia, and that's where I don't remember which source it is, actually attributes the beginning of sculpture in Etruria to that. Obviously that's complete bollocks, because terracotta sculpture goes back a very long ways, as well as bronze work in Etruria. But for a long time, people actually did assume that it was from the Greeks that the Etruscans started to urbanize, because they learned how to build things like terracotta roof tiles and other things that are close to sculpture. Not they're sculpture adjacent, we'll say, from the Greeks. But obviously, that view has been stepped back quite a bit.
And something now that we're talking about Italy, about the Romans, that the traditional account is always that after the sack of Corinth in 146 BC, General Mummius carted back to Italy loads of Greek art to Italy, and that sort of spurred on Italic artists to sort of start making stuff more in a Greek style.
Well, what is it? The legend is that before Mummius brought back the spoils of Corinth, the city of Rome wasn't decorated.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
It was only after that. But also, I mean, we hear essentially the same thing about Marcellus's sack of Syracuse, though, in the Second Punic War. I mean, there probably is some truth to it. We know that the city had architectural decoration, although I guess by the 3rd century, my knowledge starts to fall off.
But there were also Greeks in southern Italy and Sicily, so they must have seen.
Well, there were Greeks living in Rome.
Also,
there were Greeks probably living in Rome in the 6th century.
Yeah.
So we know for a fact that they were living throughout Etruria in that period.
One thing that I wanted to say, because we talked about who paid for the statues and where they were positioned, and that they were grave markers bought by private families, and that there were cult statues and public statues, but something that sort of emerges during the Hellenistic period, and that's also true for the Roman period, is that you get private collectors of art. I mean, there is no art isn't really a term that would have been understandable to Greeks and Romans, because they regarded it was all craft, basically. Building a nice house takes just as much effort as making a nice sculpture. What's the general idea? And people that worked with their hands were all sort of lumped together. But you did get like private collectors. You got large villa complexes where people wanted to decorate their gardens with statues and all that sort of stuff. So sort of the modern art collector is sort of born in the Hellenistic period, and is sort of something that the Romans also took over from let's say more Eastern wealthy elite culture, where there's this idea that you also have to sort of showcase your wealth by putting nice stuff in around your house and in your garden and that sort of thing. With the Romans, because they had such a desire to have very particular Greek sculptures, that they started making loads of copies, to the point where we know most of Greek statuary from Roman copies and Greek original, at least for the Classical and Hellenistic.
So for the 4th, even before then, in the 4th century, we actually have some records for how much people were paid for their sculptures. So the Temple of Asclepius at Epidaurus, we know that the master sculptor Timotheus paid 2,240 drachma for 3 marble acroteria, and Hectoridas was paid 3,220 drachmas for a pediment, and some other amounts that people were paid for their sculptures. So there are some records. There's some records for the Acropolis renovations building of the 5th century as well. I was actually thinking that we had some evidence for some of the Lydian sculptures. So we sort of talked about Greek influence in Italy, but it also went the other way to Anatolia, where many local rulers would hire Greek sculptors to build, say, their place of burial, and because they were called mausolus, we get the word mausoleum, and it becomes a general term for a place of burial. But I think Pliny the Elder gives us one list, and Vitruvius gives us a slightly different list of sculptures who were employed by Mausolus of Halicarnassus and his wife, who was also his sister. But we have a list of sculptors, notably Praxiteles, who I think we mentioned earlier because we discussed some of his works, but also various other named sculptors who were employed to work on the mausoleum. And this is, once again, like even with the employment of Greek sculptors, we are talking about the techniques being used in a very different cultural setting. That means that this is a monument to a king who is being buried that is nothing like what they would have been building or sculpting for in Greece in the mid-4th century, but is what the people of Halicarnassus expected. The same skills applied in different cultural contexts.
Just talking about internationalization or movement of sculptors and things. Back to Italy, supposedly when the Romans built the Temple of Diana on the Aventine, the cult statue was modeled off a statue from Massilia in southern France. Of course, I think the only record of that is Strabo, and he had no agenda to make the Greeks look culturally dominant or anything.
Yeah, we didn't really talk about portraiture though, but not a lot to say, except it gets more realistic, especially during the Hellenistic period.
Well, and then the phenomenon of the bust, that is a Roman thing.
I had a note about realism, which is, while reading for this podcast, reading several sort of overall sculpture articles to remind myself generally about sculpture, a lot of the language used sort of implied that sculptors in the Archaic period, in the 7th and 6th centuries, were incapable of achieving realism. And that gave me the impression that what these scholars were thinking was that every archaic sculptor sort of finished their work and then looked at it and was like, it's no good. It doesn't look real. And that no archaic sculptor was satisfied with their work. Whereas you get to the classical period and people suddenly have the tools, have the skills to more accurately present real, active humans. And I think there is a kernel of truth in this, in the sense that in the classical period we know that bronze sculpture was more highly regarded, more prominent, but that it doesn't survive as well, so we tend to focus on the marble sculpture, but that bronze sculpture also allowed you to do more with the pose, do more with the shape of the sculpture, and keep it balanced. So there was more freedom of movement in that time, and that may have encouraged sculptors to get more realistic, to focus more on realism as an aim. But I hope we got across in our discussion of the Archaic period the fact that this isn't entirely about realism. A lot of it is about idealization, about giving the sense of the ideal human body, whether it's an ideal male who is naked and striding forward and muscular, or the ideal female who is stationary with her maybe a hand out an offering, maybe holding a flower, or with her hand on her heart and sort of heavily dressed. The idea in these sculptures is not to get across a real person. It's not striving ever more towards realism. It is creating an ideal sort of presentation of a human being. And the fact that they don't sort of have characteristics that we would associate with an individual is not a failing on the part of archaic art. It is not the intent. Whereas in the classical period, we have many cultural changes following, in Athens, democracy, following the Persian Wars, as well as the technological changes. We have cultural changes that means they are trying to do something different with these statues. And they seem to have a greater interest in realism, in sculptures that might almost trick you into thinking they were a person, or that accurately represent something. But although, I mean, as we sort of just hinted at with portraiture, they don't really even do that. They're still getting at, like, ideal representations. Just something to note if you are reading about this yourself. The way that some scholars talk about archaic sculpture seems to imply that it's one step on a stage to the classical rather than it has its own purpose and function, which it does, and that purpose is not realism.
Yeah, it's something to keep in mind anyway, in the broader sense also. I mean, you read people that describe geometric vase painting as crude, or Cycladic idols as crude representations of the female bodies and that sort of thing. And then you're like, well, people, in the 3rd millennium BC or in the 8th century, they didn't lack the ability to do better. They just, apparently, this was what they wanted to do, what they wanted to create. There is nothing that would have precluded people from trying to render more realistic details or whatever. It's just this is what they wanted to depict, and that's what they did. So,
and certainly, although evolutionary trajectories are nonsense, you do learn skills. Like, people figure out a way of doing something that they can then teach others, and other people can then do it in that way, which may make it easier or faster. But it's not a guided trajectory. It's, again, a tool that a different cultural context can use to do something different. I thought in this article somewhere I said something like the ideal Greek man was naked and strong, the ideal Greek Athenian woman was married. But I think in later drafts I may have elaborated on that statement a little more so that it's no longer quite so pithy.
I really like that, though. That's a very to the point and worthwhile statement to make.
So in the conclusion, I say, where do I say it? The idealized men and youth of grave monuments are muscular and athletic, while their inscriptions lament the loss of one so brave and powerful. The ideal woman, meanwhile, was largely decorative. These monuments say that men do things while women simply are.
And this is a good point to wrap up the episode. We hope you've enjoyed our lengthy discussion on sculpture in the ancient Greek world. Be sure to visit our website at ancientworldmagazine.com. Our thanks to our patrons who make this podcast possible, and in particular to Rachel K. Bicknell and Joshua Addison. If you want to support us, please consider becoming a patron. Go to patreon.com/ancientworldmag to learn more. And for now, thank you for listening, and until next time, bye-bye.